What's up, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Mafia Podcast, NBA edition. My name is Jordan Jaika, aka Dr. Fantasy. I'm here with my co host, as always, the Fantasy Caveman, and we are in the middle of our series where we are breaking down each and every roster and recapping their 2019-2020 season, and then previewing their upcoming offseason, which is right around the corner. Right now, we are in the middle of all the teams that were eliminated in the playoffs. So today we're going to be talking about the Utah Jazz. During their 2019-2020 season, they were 44 and 28 under head coach Quinn Snyder. They were eliminated in the first round, but it was a pretty epic 7-game series with the Denver Nuggets, who are currently battling with the Los Angeles Lakers in the Western Conference Finals. Donovan Mitchell and Jamal Murray were trading punches the entire series, and it was a fantastic series. Could have went either way, and realistically, if they were not eliminated in the first round, we could be talking about them in the Western Conference Finals. As much as that seems crazy, anything is possible, especially with how this first round went. Their points leader on the year was Donovan Mitchell with 24. Behind him was a guy that I think is pretty underrated in Bojan Bogdanovic, 20.2 points per game. Jordan Clarkson behind him with 15.6. Rudy Gobert, Mr. Corona himself at 15.1 points. Mike Conley at 14.4 points. So this was a very well-rounded squad here. Rebounds, not surprisingly, Rudy Gobert with 13.5. Royce O'Neal behind him with 5.5.
Oh man, that's talk about a dip.
Yeah, big drop there. 13.5 from Gobert to 5.5 for Royce O'Neal. That's kind of interesting. Assist-wise, Joe Ingles actually led the team with 5.2 assists. Mike Conley was second with 4.4, which is a little surprising. Not much, actually, to talk about steal and block-wise. The only guy that averaged one steal or above was Donovan Mitchell with 1. And then blocks, the only guy that averaged above 1 was Rudy Gobert with 2. So not much to talk there, but Caveman, I'll swing it over to you. Any notes or anyone that impressed you here?
I think this for starters here. I've been saying this ever since this whole thing happened, but I've been seeing a lot of reports that have kind of made me kind of give up on it. But I think the chemistry issues between Mitchell and Gobert, I guess, all reports are and have been that they're keeping them together and they're not moving on from either one. There actually have been discussing extensions for both of them. So that's what's been flowing on. They haven't commented on it because they can't comment on player extensions right now because of the CBA, which doesn't really make any. I don't get why you can't talk about extensions for guys on your team that are still under contract for the following year. I don't get why can't you. That just bothers me for some reason. Like why?
Because the rules are made up.
Why? I don't. I mean. So going on to a couple of you guys talk about Donovan Mitchell, who, is he's one of those guys that are on a cusp of being a superstar.
I was going to ask you that.
He's not a superstar yet, but if he plays like he did last season, and he plays like that again, I think he will be. And Donovan Mitchell himself brought up a great point. A tiny bit off topic here, but yesterday he tweeted the official Uno card game account and said, "Can you put a draw 4 over a draw 2?" That was a tweet from Donovan Mitchell the other day. I'm sure you'd love the Uno. Can you put a draw 4 over a draw 2?
So I think officially no, but house rules, yes.
Okay, so that was just kind of something fun. I just saw that. I was looking at my research and kind of laughed here. With Donovan Mitchell, he averaged 24 points, 4 rebounds, 4 assists, with 37% from 3. So he's about league average from 3. But in the playoffs, he really stepped it up. He averaged 36.5. So he upped his point total in the playoffs. I think Donovan Mitchell I mean, can he right now? I don't think he can be a team that you can build a championship around. But I think he has the potential to be a number 2 on a championship team, depending on who the number 1 is. And then another
Giannis?
guy that what?
Giannis?
Yes, yes, totally. If Jazz can win the title if Giannis went there and paired with Jonathan Mitchell. But another guy who wasn't really mentioned, what sounds like a lot of people talk about, but that Bojan Bogdanovic, who averaged over 20 a game, he was very consistent. As pretty much when you take a look at the rest of the players on the Jazz, they don't really offer a much offensively outside of Donovan Mitchell and Joe Ingles to a lesser extent. But Bojan averaged 20 points a game and shot 41% from three. So I think he's going to be it's probably easily their number 2 option offensively and probably their third best, second or third. I think I'd like him more than Gobert, but second or third best player going forward. So he was impressive for me this season with what he was able to put together.
Yeah, and I'll touch up on that point a little bit too, because he was one that stuck out for me.
Mm-hmm.
That 3-point percentage is always more impressive when you look at his volume. I mean, he was shooting over 7 threes a game, and he was making 3. So, he has a very nice percentage there. Rudy Gobert, I mean, in general, I don't think he gets enough credit for how talented he is defensively. Because based on his defensive ability alone, he's by far the number 2 player, in my opinion. And I like Bogdanovic a lot. But, I mean, Rudy Gobert is arguably the best defensive center in the entire league. I mean, he's won back-to-back defensive player of the years before this season. So he's one of the best defenders in the league. So, besides that, there's no one else that overly stands out to me, honestly. I mean, Jordan Clarkson had a nice season, but we've seen this for, the past few years from him. He comes off the bench, averages right around 15 or so points. I think he's the younger version of like Lou Williams or Jamal Crawford right now. Just a guard coming off the bench, always averaging 15, 16, 17 points a game, and there's a lot of value there. So he has a nice role with this team right now. But yeah, I mean, I personally don't have many other notes on him, so I'll move over to their depth chart here. We've mentioned a lot of these names already, but at the point guard, they have Mike Conley, who is their highest paid player as of right now at $34 million for the next
player
season.
Option for $34 million.
Player option.
Which, okay, if Mike Conley turns down $34 million, I don't know what to tell you.
Nope, he won't. Jordan Clarkson behind him. Emmanuel Mudiay was their third point guard last year, name that I haven't heard in a little while. Number 2, at the 2, they have Donovan Mitchell, Jordan Clarkson, Joe Ingles. At the 3, Bojan Bogdanovic, Joe Ingles, Royce O'Neal. At the 4, right now, they have Royce O'Neal and Georges Yang listed right now. At the 5, Rudy Gobert, Tony Bradley, and Ed Davis. So a lot of names that we've mentioned already. And I kind of already mentioned Mike Conley's contract has a player option for $34 million. I'd be surprised if he turned that down. Realistically on the market right now, and he's 32, going to be 33 here, so he's looking for his last contract most likely of his NBA career, but we've definitely seen him not be the same player that he was in the past, so I don't think he's in for a very big deal, which is the reason why I think he's probably going to do it, especially with all the uncertainty around the salary cap. I mean, you take your $34 million and you definitely take advantage of that. The only reason he was in the position to make that a player option was because it was part of his contract. He had to play in 55 games either this year or the year prior. So now he has the option to stay or not. Besides that, they have a ton of options this year. Half of their bench, and these are guys I didn't mention, but they have a lot of options. Not Tony Bradley, Georges Niang, Nigel Williams-Goss, Mai Oni, Rajon Tucker, all those big names, but they all have non-guaranteed contracts right now. The biggest free agent they have is Jordan Clarkson, who I already mentioned. Behind him, Emmanuel Mudiay, also a free agent this year. A couple two-way contracts, some minimum salary guys, and Jawan Morgan, Justin Wright Foreman, and Gerald Brantley. I have to say those names if you haven't watched before, because Caveman yells at me if I don't mention the two-way
Yeah.
contracts. So if you're like, why is he talking about Gerald Brantley? That's why, because I'll get yelled at. So who do you think they need to retain this offseason?
I mean, yeah, you look at they have pretty much had their core group of guys under contract, and I know we'll see what happens, but they're obviously they've been talking extensions for both Mitchell and Gobert. But Jordan Clarkson is an interesting name.
Hmm.
I mean, he can leave if he wants to, but the interesting thing to keep in note with Jordan Clarkson is that the Jazz have his bird rights, so they can they can bring him back at whatever, like if let's say they can bring him back at 25 million if they want. Not that they would, obviously, but I'm just saying like theoretically they could basically so basically just in case people aren't too familiar with bird rights. If a team has the player's bird rights, it basically means they can go over their salary cap to re-sign that guy. So Clarkson's gonna be an interesting name. I mean, he's that prototypical sixth man scoring guard. I mean,
Yep.
he's not. I mean, I think people say he's a point guard, but he's not really much of a passer. He's kind of like a score first point guard off the bench. So that'll be an interesting name. I think they should look to retain him if possible. But that's really the only note. Not a ton other than Clarkson. So I'd like to see them retain him if possible. It's kind of because if you take Jordan Clarkson off that Utah bench, like it's very very not exciting bench if they take if you take Jordan Clarkson off that bench. So that'll be interesting to see what happens with him.
Yeah, and I agree that I think they definitely need to bring him back. I think it's one of the most underrated parts of a championship roster is that second unit. I mean, we're seeing it. The Lakers are the first team that comes to my mind right now because they're not really known for their second unit. But we've seen Rondo and Dwight Howard and these other guys come off the bench and contribute. And that's been a differentiating factor in playoff series before is when these superstars get gassed, who's coming off the bench. And if you don't have quality there, it makes it a lot more challenging. So I think that needs to be a priority for him. I'll talk about other offseason needs here. The biggest one for me is the power forward position. Personally, I don't think Royce O'Neal, who's listed as their starter there, is the answer right now. So that's number one for me personally. They also don't have a lot of depth behind him, so I think they need to upgrade that position. I also think that they need to start thinking about their long-term plan at point guard, which might seem a little crazy, but Mike Conley is getting older. This is realistically his last year. I've seen a few mock drafts, and I was actually thinking this before I even saw them, where they have them taking a point guard to replace Conley not this year, but the season after. So I think that's just an interesting note is after Conley runs his $34 million this year, do we realistically think he's the point guard of the future? I would say probably not.
No.
Unless their plan is to re-sign Jordan Clarkson and let him play the one. But you just mentioned it. I don't think I'd want Jordan Clarkson as my starting point guard. I don't really think he's a strong point guard. I think he's perfect in the role that he's in right now, and I don't think there's any reason to change that. So they could use a little. I think those were my two notes there. I'll mention a few names. They do have a little bit of cap flexibility right now, especially considering they can go over for Jordan Clarkson, which I'm glad you brought that up because I had that in my notes as well. But
Mm.
I really think they do need a strong four, and there's some interesting names. I think this would be especially. I keep reading the Pistons don't want to bring back Christian Wood, and we talked about Christian Wood in the Pistons episode. But I mean, he's a really young, promising player, and I loved what he showed last year. So I think be really interesting. He's not necessarily defensively minded either, and they can afford to take a little bit of a hit at the 4 position because of Rudy Gobert. So if you have Christian Wood more stretching the floor next to Gobert, I think that's a nice fit, and that's where they should go. They don't need another guy to clog up the paint with Rudy Gobert. They need another guy that can stretch the floor a little bit. So I think he would be an interesting fit. And I mentioned a million times, there's lots of veteran. This free agency class, there's not a lot of superstars, but there's a lot of depth to it, a lot of veteran depth and guys that can play important roles on your team. I mean, I saw several reports where Derek Favors wants to go back to Utah, so that could be a potential reunion that you see. Paul Millsap obviously makes sense. You could probably throw him anywhere and it would make sense.
Mhm.
Tristan Thompson, I've seen also connected to them. If you're looking at the draft, a few names I had were they have the 23rd overall pick, so there's not a ton of strong 4s in this class. The 2 best ones in that area are Jaden McDaniels and Tyler Bay. If they do want to go the route of replacing Mike Conley long term and letting this guy sit behind him, learn, and then take over the season after that. Kira Lewis, I've seen mocked to them several times, and we did a prospect pod on him. I like his upside quite a bit, and that's perfect because I don't think he's going to be ready to play day one. So you let him sit behind Mike Conley and learn a little bit, get a feel for the game, and have him replace Conley long term. But I think that's all I have. I'll kick it over to you now.
All right. Yeah, you certainly went. I mean, so yeah, I have, aside from the first need, which is uh not not a position, but my first need for them is the officially extend Donovan Mitchell. I mean, you can't.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a no brainer, but that has to be mentioned. You brought up, and then after that, I have what you touched on, and that's the just guard depth in general. Because I mean, with Conley, let's face it, he's 32 years old. He also has had trouble staying healthy in the recent years. So you gotta kind of look at, trying to find a guy that could play and run your offense while if Conley misses any time, because they don't really have that on the roster right now. So if Mike Conley goes down, I think you're basically forcing Donovan Mitchell to run the point, which I'm not. I really like Donovan Mitchell, but I don't think that's where you want your star guy. Uh, and then surprisingly, I think they also, you look at it, they got to get some depth at center behind Rudy Gobert, because after him, what do they have at center? I mean, he's very good, and I think he's perfect as your typical franchise. But they need some depth behind him, and I'm sure they're gonna sign some veteran in free agency. But then I think so couple of names. I have actually an interesting name that that could be intriguing is Derek Jones. Thinking of fantasy football and how I just traded Daniel Jones, but it's Derek Jones we're talking about here. I think if you look at it, the depth at wing behind Ingles, who isn't really the greatest. So I think you had a guy like Derek Jones to kind of bolster. He'd be some nice athleticism and energy to that second unit for Utah. And another name that, as I did some deeper diving, that I found is Sterling Brown from Milwaukee. He is a restricted free agent, which means the Bucks can match any offer. But if you look at the Bucks this season, I mean, Sterling Brown basically fell out of the rotation this season for the Bucks.
Mm-hmm.
But when he was playing, he was very solid and produced for him. But he just wasn't in their plans in the rotation. So I think he could be a solid difference maker on the wing for them. He can shoot the ball pretty well. Then they want to go the draft route. And this is an intriguing name and probably one of the more kind of like more of a gamble, uh, one of the more gamble players in the draft. But R.J. Hampton,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the only thing that gives me pause about that is they drafted a guy who's supposed to be a similar guy to R.J. Hampton coming out of college, and that was Dante Exum. And look how that worked out for him.
Yeah.
So I think if they want to take another stab at trying to get a guy that they were hoping Exum would be, I think R.J. Hampton could be an interesting name. And the thing with the Jazz, they have a pretty. I mean, the four position isn't the greatest, but I think Royce O'Neal is about an average starting four. I don't think he's that bad. But overall, their starting lineup isn't terrible with the way you look at it. So I think for me, I'd rather see them kind of take a chance on a guy with a lot of upside. And I think when you talk about R.J. Hampton, he's one of those guys that he's so there's so many wide range of outcomes for R.J. Hampton. He could possibly be, and his is very similar. I think I would say him and Cole Anthony are two of the biggest, the kind of the lowest floor but the highest ceiling guys. And I think
Boom bust, yeah.
boom bust, but yeah. So I think R.J. Hampton's one of those guys that the Jazz can go to try to take a chance. I mean, it kind of for the Jazz, it kind of depends where they see if they want to get just a solid rotation guy that are going to help them now, or do they want to kind of take a chance on a guy? And R.J. Hampton would be a good guy to take a chance on.
Yep. Yeah, and I've mentioned him and Cole Anthony several times, so I definitely agree with that. And the Jazz are in a position where if he busts, it's not going to be the end of their franchise realistically. Yeah. They're looking for more role players at this point. Although I do think that if they don't solve that point guard issue long term or start thinking about it now, that could hurt them. I mean, we've seen how important that position is in today's NBA, so I definitely think they need to try to make some sort of move to set themselves up well long term. But let's look at where we see them finishing in the future here next season. So they were the 6th seed this year. They're a team that I really like personally. I mean, they were one of the best defensive teams in the league. I love my defense. And
it's hard not to be a good defensive team when you have a clogger like Gobert in the middle.
Yeah. They allowed the 3rd fewest points per game in the West last year, actually in the entire league. So they were very good last season. So I like watching the Jazz and teams like the Nuggets. I know everybody likes watching their Rockets, like the Caveman. You like the big points, but I loved watching Game 1 of the Nuggets and Lakers because even though there was a lot of scoring, there was a lot of great defensive plays as well. So that's what I like watching. But with this roster and how it's constructed, I mean, I think it'll be kind of hard for them to completely fall out of the playoffs, but we've talked about it before. I mean, with the way that this roster is constructed, with how deep the Western Conference is, I don't know. Honestly, it wouldn't surprise me. I think it would be challenging. I still think they'll find themselves, especially when you consider the Thunder want to rebuild from what it seems like. Seems like the Jazz will be in that 5, 6, 7 range in the Western Conference. I do think it would take quite a bit for them to completely fall out, but there's a lot of these young teams that are up and coming. So if the Jazz didn't make the playoffs, I don't think it would be because of them. I think it would be maybe because somebody else propelled themselves ahead of the Jazz. Because I think the Jazz are a solid, book them down for right around 45 wins. I think that's the kind of team this is, how they're constructed, and I can't really see that changing.
Yeah, I mean, if you take a look at it, when you have arguably definitely the best defensive center in the league, and one of the best overall defenders in the league, and then you got Donovan Mitchell, who if he plays like he did last year, is a superstar. I mean, with that tandem, it's gonna be hard to see them not make the playoffs. There's a lot of there's a lot of teams that are in that Jazz range, like the Mavericks and the the Rockets and the Thunder. I mean, I feel here we go. It was me this time to kind of to talk about the Thunder, but I mean, I don't want to say they won't make the playoffs next year because they weren't supposed to make the playoffs this year. Uh, so, but they might be around. So I don't expect them to fall out of the playoffs. I think they'll make the playoffs even if it's like as a 7-8. But they're so talented defensively, and they have some decent offensive pieces. And I mean not the greatest defensive pieces, but you got a guy like Donovan Mitchell, and then you got Rudy Gobert. It's just hard to imagine them not making the playoffs. I mean, probably they're not gonna get any farther. Like they're still gonna be out in the first round probably, but they're just kind of one of those run of the mill mid to lower seed teams, and that's kind of where they're at.
Let me ask you. So we've talked about several Western Conference teams now, and I feel like we keep saying all of them have a chance to make the playoffs.
Yeah,
because that's a reality. I mean, we saw how competitive it was for that 8 seed in the bubble. So, but you love your Pelicans.
I do love my Pelicans.
And you think the Pelicans are going to make the playoffs. So which playoff team falls off and falls out of the playoffs in order for the Pelicans to make it next year? Is it the Thunder? Is that the obvious answer?
I mean, that's the obvious answer. I mean,
let's say the Thunder are good again, and we're they're better than everyone's anticipating.
Pick a team other than the Thunder.
So I mean, because you're looking Lakers, no, right? Clippers, no. Nuggets, definitely not. The Rockets, no. The Thunder, we're just going to assume for a second that the Thunder are going to be good again, and realistically, that's the choice. But the Jazz, Mavericks, Trailblazers are your other options.
Boy, I mean that's that makes it very interesting. I mean, thing is, if you look at it with Portland, like they're better than what their record reflected, I think. They got hit with the injury bug this season. I mean, if it's not the Thunder, as much as I don't think it's gonna happen, I think I would probably go with Dallas. I mean, that's tough. If I had to, honestly, a clear answer for me for the Pelicans to get in. The OKC is not gonna be the one out, but if I had to pick another one, I mean, I think I would go with. I think I would have to go with Dallas. I mean, they're one of the weaker. They're one of the weaker teams when you're talking about next year and the range of outcomes for the lower seeds in the West. I think the Mavericks are one of those iffy ones. So. Probably the Mavericks.
It's definitely a tough call, though, and that's kind of what I'm saying with the Jazz. Is as much as their roster, I think it'd be surprising if they miss the playoffs. But there's so many teams in that range. I mean, we talk about the Thunder falling out of the playoffs. The Thunder had the same exact record as the Jazz this past year. They were 44-28. So it's just funny the difference. They were like, oh, the Thunder aren't going to make it again. But I mean, and we keep assuming the Thunder fall out, but. I mean, it's so close in this range, and we had a young team like the Grizzlies that were up and coming, and the Suns are up and coming. As much as you want to count the Spurs out because of their roster, if Greg Popovich is there, it's hard to count them out. You have the Pelicans at the bottom. We still haven't talked about the Warriors. I mean, they have their core coming back. So if we want the Warriors, the Pelicans, all these teams to make it, some of these guys have to fall out. So that's where I think it starts getting really interesting in the West is I would be surprised if the Jazz fell out, especially with Donovan Mitchell's ascension. I was impressed with him and how much he improved. But, I mean, they could win 44 games and miss the playoffs. That's how good I think the West is. And that seems crazy. But I think that's the reality of how competitive it is. So it'll be fun. It was just a random question. Not that it's overly relevant. I like the Jazz. I'm not trying to belittle them. They play the style of basketball that I like. So, yeah. I do think that
you did that because you wanted to find another way to belittle the Thunder again.
Basically. Actually, I was giving them credit. I was saying everyone's counting the Thunder out, which we did this year, and then they just kept balling. So It's just I don't think you can completely count them out, even though they've kind of alluded to they want to rebuild. But even so, if the Thunder fall out, I mean, I think the Warriors replace them, but that's a whole different conversation. We'll
Yep.
have to give our standings prediction in a pod in the future when we get
Yep.
closer to the season. But
Pelicans top 4 seed.
that's what you said. That's insanity. But I mean, crazier things have happened, I guess. So I think that's all that I have. Anything else you want to throw in there?
Nope. That's just interesting. Interesting to see where they finish next year, since how closely they're grouped with the others.
I'm just happy because before we started this episode, we talked for like 20 minutes about the Miami Heat and the San Antonio Spurs. So I'm glad we were able to focus on the Utah Jazz for 30 minutes here. So I appreciate everybody listening to our Jazz talk here. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube, subscribe to wherever you listen to podcasts. We have lots more to do. We're just halfway through the playoff teams now. So more teams have obviously been eliminated as we've moved through the playoffs. So keep an eye out for more content there. If you haven't already, make sure you go back and listen to our previous previews as well. And there's an NBA playlist on our YouTube channel. You can roll through and look at all those. So make sure you check that out. Lots of great content. Draft is going to be here as soon as you know it. About 2 months since they pushed it back. So gives us a lot more time to talk about the NBA draft as well. So
Yep.
appreciate everybody listening, everybody who likes and comments, and we'll see you guys next time.
Yep.